Welcome to the Gonzaga Socratic Club. This is our first meeting of the 2015-16 academic year. I have to wear two hats today. I am the introducer, but I'm also the speaker. So I usually get to introduce people and then pass the baton, but I'm going to have some things to say later on. I do want to say a little bit about the Gonzaga Socratic Club. If you haven't been before, don't know what we're up to, the Socratic Club follows the model of the Oxford Socratic Club, which flourished on the campus of Oxford University. Gee, what a big surprise. In the mid-1900s, it was presided over by the very well-known Christian apologist C.S. Lewis, and their motto was to follow the argument wherever it leads, especially concerning matters of philosophical treatment of religion. So we followed the Oxford Socratic Club with the Gonzaga Socratic Club, and we consider, broadly speaking, matters in the Christian worldview from a broadly philosophical point of view. The rest of this semester we have events scheduled. This is a change to be on Monday afternoon, and I'm really pleased that you guys showed up. I had no idea. We normally meet on Friday afternoons when activities around campus are winding down and people are thinking, what's a way to entertain myself before Friday evening rolls around? And the Socratic Club often fills that gap, but it won't this semester anyway. We're trying this experiment, and if this is the data of my experiment, at least the first instantiation of the data, it looks like Monday afternoons work pretty well. So thanks for coming today. We will be meeting again on October the 5th. Tentatively, these are the dates: October the 5th, November the 9th, and December the 7th. And we have talks planned on secularism in Star Trek. How does that sound? Pretty bizarre. And early church history. So stay tuned. I always make a point to bring to the Socratic Club a sign-up sheet for our listserv. I forgot to do that today. I got here at the last minute. You guys who are here early know. You beat me here. So if you're interested in signing up, maybe if somebody just has a blank piece of paper, I can mooch one off of you. And okay, I see several volunteers. Maybe just stick it over on the table with a pen. Thank you, Rob. And if you just want to write your email down, this is the lazy way to get on the Socratic Club's mailing list, because if you want, you can actually go to the Socratic Club website, which is very easy to find. Gonzaga Socratic Club, Google search, it pops up first. And there are instructions there for signing up for our listserv. If you're one of those people who thinks, I don't need more complication in my life, I promise I only send out about 10 emails a year or so. Very, very minimal, very skimpy, but very high quality. So it's worth cluttering your email inbox in the minimal way that it will do. So I strongly advise that. The talk that we're going to consider today, or the topic we're going to consider today, is the epistemology of belief formation. And I should have asked somebody else to introduce me, but here I am. I'm David Calhoun. I'm a professor in the philosophy department. I've been here since 1989. And the Socratic Club, I'm actually pleased to divert attention from myself to the Socratic Club. The Socratic Club is today beginning its 11th year of operation. We celebrate our 10th anniversary last year, so we've been on campus now for over a decade. And by the way, students who haven't heard about this before, the club name may be a little misleading. We're using the name Gonzaga Socratic Club, as I said, because we're following the lead of the Oxford Socratic Club. But you don't have to join, you don't have to be a member, you can just show up. We're just here for having interesting conversation and discussion. So the name Socratic in the label might throw some people off because it's not primarily about ancient philosophy, but as in the case of the Oxford Socratic Club, I mentioned that their motto was a Socratic motto from the Platonic dialogues, to follow the argument wherever it leads. And the other reason that it's appropriate that Socrates, even though he's a pagan, that he be baptized and brought into the fold here with our name, is that he affirmed the value of rational philosophical reflection. And indeed, he's famous for the comment quoted in Plato's Apology, "The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being." And I would say that we can affirm that for Christian theists as well, that we affirm the idea, at least philosophically inclined Christian theists want to say that we should reflect on, think about what it means to be a theist, what it means to be a Christian, or even, as in the case of the talk I mentioned about Star Trek, that'll be at the end of the semester, that's looking at secularism, the phenomenon of movement away from religion that we find in culture and popular culture. So we take all comers. We've had atheists and agnostics and skeptics and theists and so forth present at the Socratic. So I hope you'll try again and come again sometime. But with that, let's turn to the topic of at hand for today. We're looking at the question of belief formation, and I have a particular angle in wanting to talk about belief formation. And that's to address a question about religious belief that often goes under the label fideism. If you know your Latin, fide means belief, or faith. So fideism is beliefism or faithism, right? So what would that mean? Well, fideism is a view about religious belief. It's a view about belief in general, but specifically about religious belief. That religious belief is based on no evidence whatsoever. That religious belief is a matter of action by the will, a choice by the mind, or so forth, and that it's not based on evidence. And this has really become important in recent discussions about religious faith, especially in contrast with science. And we have the critics that are usually called the new atheists. You may have heard of these folks, people like Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett, or if you saw the reboot of the Cosmos series, Neil deGrasse Tyson would be another example. And they tend to contrast religious belief with scientific knowledge, which they want to argue is produced by relevant evidence. Okay, here we go. Yeah, this is what I want to get to. So in general, I think we have a basic idea about belief, and I think we can capture it by starting with the belief that is right at the front of our thinking right at this moment. I suspect that most of you right now would affirm that you believe that you are attending a meeting of the Socratic Club located in College Hall 101 on a Monday afternoon, right? Am I right about that? Okay, unless we have paranoid folks here or delusional people here, right? That's a belief. And let's think about why we hold that belief. We hold that belief because of what scientists sometimes call a consilience of relevant evidence. That is, if we tack together our perceptual evidence right now, you see things, you hear things, right? You're sitting down in a large room with other people. You see someone standing at a podium talking about belief and evidence, and I've just introduced the meeting by saying this is a meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club, and you saw advertisements perhaps on the take notice or a poster, or someone in a class or someone else, a friend perhaps, told you about it. So you have perceptual evidence, you maybe have testimonial evidence, you have documentary evidence of one kind or another, and all of that evidence, of course, works together to produce this belief in you, right? Now, something interesting to notice about that belief, which we'll explore more in a little bit here, but notice that it would be strange to say that you choose to believe that you're at the Socratic Club, at a meeting of the Socratic Club right now. Do you see what I mean? That belief has been produced in you causally as a product of the various kinds of evidence that are appropriate in this case. Okay? Now, of course, what the new atheists that I've mentioned want to insist is that scientific evidence and scientific knowledge is the paradigmatic case of evidentialist belief. In other words, we believe things about the natural world because of the inquiries of science, because they amass a consilience of a combining together, a meshing together of relevant evidence in such a way that they produce the belief in us. And indeed, if you think about evidence of, or if you think about beliefs that we have, scientific beliefs about the natural world that seem second nature to us, like the claim that the Earth rotates the sun rather than the sun rotating or orbiting the Earth, and the nature of volcanoes as produced by lava activity below the surface of the Earth, and so on and so forth, right? You can think of these kinds of examples. It sounds really weird to talk about, do I want to believe that or not want to believe it, right? It just sounds strange to talk in those terms. Indeed, we might even say an extreme case of the kind of evidentiary belief I'm talking about, I haven't used it because it's a little bit different in character, is the beliefs that we have about conceptual disciplines like mathematics or logic, right? That we don't choose to believe that 2 + 3 = 5. That belief is produced in us, in most cases, by a combination of rational reflection, testimony by those who are authorities on the matter, our teachers in elementary school and so forth. Okay? Now the contrast is between that and religious belief, because we clearly know that religious belief isn't like that, or at least it seems to us that religious belief is not like that. And so New Atheist critics have suggested that religious belief should be understood as something radically different in kind. So where do people get beliefs like the belief that God is 3 in 1, or the belief that God came to earth in human form, lived a perfect life, and died for human beings? Where do those beliefs come from? Well, you could say they come from testimonial evidence, from the scriptures and so forth, teachers. But the New Atheist would argue if you keep tracing it back, where does it ultimately come from? And their claim is it doesn't come from anywhere, because there is no relevant evidence that would support that. Other examples, of course, would include claims about miracles and so forth. Those are simply beliefs that are conjured up out of nowhere. And so, according to the New Atheist critics, they want to argue that religious belief is fideistic in character. All religious beliefs are bare, blind assertions. And indeed, some who actually know the scriptures will suggest that, oh, well, you know what? The Christian scriptures actually support this fideistic conception. Because you have these ideas like 2 Corinthians 5:7, Paul speaking, he says, we live by faith, not by sight. So faith is blind, right? You aren't seeing anything. You're just taking a leap into the unknown. Or a scripture that I'll come back to, this is the proclamation of the father of an epileptic boy in Mark's gospel. I do believe, when Jesus asked him, do you believe that I can heal your son? The man says, well, I do believe, help me in my unbelief. So you get this idea that what he's doing is we're catching him in the act of conjuring up the belief out of nothing, right? That's what it looks like anyway. Okay. Well, what are we going to try to do here? Wow, this has been a long preface, but I hope you at least feel like you understand the problem a little more clearly at this point. We're going to try to analyze what belief is, to explore how belief operates, and specifically look at the connection between belief and evidence in a broad sense, not so much in the character of religious belief. And then we're going to try to apply that to shed light on religious belief, the account of faith, what faith is, and how it works. I want to say a little bit about a move that I want to make from the beginning here. Most contemporary theorists of knowledge, if you want to use the fancy philosophy word, they're called epistemologists. Most contemporary epistemologists think of analysis of belief in normative or prescriptive terms. That is to say, they tend to focus on whether or not one ought to believe this or that question, whether it's believing in the fact that we're in College Hall right now at a meeting of the Socratic Club, or belief that Christ as God come to earth in human form. They ask the question whether we ought to believe this or that, and whether beliefs are held justifiably. I want to admit and concede that these are important questions because we want our beliefs to be true. We care about the truth of our beliefs, and justification of our beliefs or reliable processes of belief formation are ways that we consider and indeed verify the reliability or truth of our beliefs. But to shed new light on the question I want to ask, I want to shift the focus in my talk to a descriptive account of belief to try to get a clearer idea of what belief is and how it works. To use, again, another fancy philosophy term that some folks here will understand, I'm trying to do a phenomenology of belief, to look at how belief appears to us descriptively rather than trying to sketch it out in normative terms. Okay, so what is belief? I think it's interesting that when belief is defined, again, this is mostly by epistemologists, philosophers who consider knowledge and truth and how it works. They tend to describe belief in intellectual, cognitive, or linguistic terms, some combination of intellectual, cognitive, and linguistic, as being something true, or belief is the act of accepting some statement or proposition as stating what is the case. Now, I don't really have any quibble with that. I would point out, though, that that belief often, in the practical, concrete sense, concerns acceptances about the way the world is or how the world is, and they are often held in precognitive, even in articulable ways. Certainly, we could articulate them, right? If someone asks you, do you believe X? We can start reflecting on that question and think about why or why not we might think that X is true or not true. But most of our beliefs are held implicitly, and again, that's something that I'm going to touch on later on. Indeed, I mean, I can actually draw your attention to the example that I've already used, the belief that you have that you're attending a meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club. I suspect, until I brought your attention to that, you hadn't thought about the fact that you believe that that's what's happening right now. So that would be an example of a belief that you held, but it was held inarticulately, precognitively. Okay. I want to start by looking at a basically evidentialist account of how, well, not start, we're well into the process here. I want to start with or give an evidentialist account if we're doing this phenomenology of belief. Now, what I think we notice, if we think about examples like the one that I've already given about your belief that you're at a meeting of the Gonzaga Socratic Club, we can see that it makes sense to talk about beliefs as produced in us causally by relevant evidence. After all, we don't simply choose to believe things like our physical location, what day it is, what the weather is, whether or not we are alone at a particular time, or so forth. Beliefs on these matters are caused in us by the power of relevant evidence, like what we perceive, what relevant authoritative testimony we have available to us, and so on. I want to call this view descriptive evidentialism. Namely, it's the view that beliefs are produced in us by the causal power of relevant evidence. This is a descriptive view, notice, because I'm trying to capture what beliefs are rather than saying what we ought to do. Remember the contrast between descriptive and normative here. Now, as it turns out, I think that you can see how a descriptive account of evidentialist belief formation could lead us to a normative conception of belief. In other words, what we ought to believe. If beliefs are in fact the causal product of relevant evidence, then those that are true are the ones properly produced by evidence, while those that are false are ones produced by error, deception, or other forms of faulty evidence, or by processes that allow such conditions to be present as formed, as beliefs are formed. Thus, normative evidentialism can be seen to be dependent upon descriptive evidentialism, right? So if we have a basic account by which we think that beliefs are in fact produced by relevant evidence, then we might use that as the basis for a view, an ought view, a view about how beliefs ought to be formulated. Further, we might notice at this point that many beliefs that seem to have a tenuous connection to immediate and direct evidence, and here where the new atheists, skeptics, and so forth would point out religious beliefs, would be subject to attack as unjustified or even in principle unjustifiable on the evidentialist account. And so as a matter of fact, there are a number of atheistic and skeptical criticisms of religious belief, such as the famous Ethics of Belief offered by W.K. Clifford. In other words, the idea that we ought never to believe anything except on the basis of sufficient evidence. Okay. But I want to argue that evidentialism is clearly not the last word in understanding belief formation. The same body of evidence can impel different people to markedly divergent beliefs. And as an example, I would cite the appeal of detective stories. The key part of the appeal of detective stories is their emphasis on how one understands evidence, the awareness that one must see the data in a particular way in order to solve the mystery. We are even aware of the plausibility of thinking that appreciating and making sense of evidence requires willed action, and indeed sometimes requires willed action at a heroic level. In a rather famous essay, George Orwell says, "To see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle." Think about what he's saying there, right? To actually apprehend evidence requires the activity, the activation of will. You have to want to do something. You have to engage the world in a certain way. Similarly, another example, a significant part of the pleasure of thrillers is the surprise one experiences at realizing that the data of the story can and indeed should be viewed in a different way. I don't know if you're a fan of M. Night Shyamalan. He tends to make movies very unevenly. Some are terrible, some are very good. Signs is very good. If you've never seen it, you should take a look and watch it. The Sixth Sense. I won't spoil either of these films if you haven't seen them by telling you everything that happens, but I'll kind of spoil them by saying both of them are about seeing data in the world in a different way. In other words, the way that you are led to see the data as the story unfolds, we gradually come to understand that's a mistake. There's a different way to see what's going on. This effect is something like what you may be familiar with at what's called the Gestalt shift. And speaking of that, there's a famous example or illustration discussed by the analytic philosopher Wittgenstein. What do you see? Yeah, that's a real question. You can answer it. What do you see? Duck.
And a rabbit.
And a rabbit. So which is it, a duck or a rabbit? Okay, so you can see that there's a sense in which the objective lines on the page. This isn't Wittgenstein's version. He hand drew, scrawled a very simple version, but this is where he got it from an older essay by a guy named, I forget, Jastrow, right? And he included his simple illustration in his book, The Philosophical Investigations. Perhaps it's true, let's think in evidentialist terms here, right? Perhaps it's true that we're conditioned to see one of the possible interpretations first. So maybe you are conditioned to see the duck first. Maybe the duck is more obvious because it's not pointed in a way that we don't expect. I've actually seen drawings of the duck rabbit that angle it so that it's almost equally easy to see either of them simultaneously. But in any case, our capacity to shift between interpretations shows that we can voluntarily alter what I would call our interpretive frame or our interpretive stance. In other words, the evidential data, which is the lines on in this case it's the digital lines on the PowerPoint display, they're simply there in an objective sense, but we can see them or perceive them in different ways depending on how we view the object. And we understand even, the more we look at it, this is a comment by philosopher of science Thomas Calhoun, who writes about the duck rabbit. He points out that the more we look at it, the more we can see past the two interpretations of what it is, the duck and the rabbit, and see the lines themselves and understand that it's an act of interpretation that leads us to see it as either a duck or a rabbit. I have another silly example. It's, one time when I was in college, when I was an undergraduate, I went to visit my sister. This is a perceptual example of what I'm talking about. And I walked in the door of her apartment and I smelled something in the air and I said, smells like cookies. I thought I was smelling chocolate chip cookies. Well, my sister looked at me with the most a stunned expression and she said, I'm boiling rutabagas. I don't know if you've ever see this joke falls flat on anyone, but you guys don't know what rutabagas are. Rutabagas are I don't know, depending on what you like, some people might say they're a nasty root vegetable, kind of like turnips, only orange and strange anyway. So that was a case where, notice I experienced that Gestalt shift where according to my understanding, my interpretation of the chemicals that were passing over my olfactory organs, I interpreted that chocolate chip cookies were baking somewhere nearby, and I couldn't have been farther from the truth. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that the will or choice does play a role in belief. But here's an interesting question. What's the role? Can we delimit it? Can we spell it out? I want to argue that while we can conclude that will or choice plays some role in belief formation, we've already noted that beliefs are not simply produced by will. We don't conjure them up out of nothing, ex nihilo, to use the theological term. I think there's a really interesting thought experiment that shows us this. It's the thought experiment that gives us the contrast between imagination and belief. If I ask you to, and you can do this if you'd like, if you're feeling experimental here, if you close your eyes, and I said, right now, imagine a pink and purple polka dotted elephant suspended from the ceiling, you can do it, right? Am I right? Can you do that? Can you imagine? It's bizarre, I know, a strange one. I picked an odd one on purpose, but you can imagine it. Now here's a slightly different command on my part. Okay, you've imagined it, now believe it. Ready? Go. Were you able to believe it? Can you produce the belief that there is a pink and purple polka dotted elephant suspended from the ceiling of this room? Anyone, please. Yes, we need interaction here. Can you believe it? No. Why not? Why can't you believe it? What's different about imagining and believing? It seems like that's what it would be, right? If, for example, you heard a strange swishing sound, like the sound of an elephant. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention something. This elephant is invisible, by the way. Does that help? Can you believe it now? No, that really doesn't help either, right? But if we had some evidence, something to go on, right? If we heard a strange swishing sound that wasn't accounted for by anyone's shuffling of their papers, or we smelled that dusty, peanutty, dirty smell that you get when you pass by the elephant exhibit at the zoo, right? We might believe there's an elephant suspended from the ceiling, but it would only be as a result of that evidence. So imagination, which seems to be limited only by our imaginative powers, right, is very different in kind from belief, which is produced in us by evidence. Now, if I've said, though, that belief, that will or choice plays a role, but will can't simply conjure beliefs up, then how are we supposed to think about this relationship? Beliefs involve evidence, but at the same time they are in some way responsive to will or choice. They cannot be wholly conjured up by will alone. The best way to see the relationship, then, is one that has some choice in the matter about how one sees evidence, but the evidence itself, viewed from within an interpretive framework, produces beliefs in a rather straightforwardly, we might even say, again, a kind of causally productive kind of way. Will or choice, along with emotion and habit, shapes the outlook that we take toward the world, what I'm calling the interpretive stance or framework. Critically, the interpretive stance orients us toward the world in a way that specifies how we will read experience, whether we will take it as evidence for this or that belief, and how then we will apply it as evidence. The text gets a little bit off of the PowerPoint here, so I have to sort of pay attention to what I'm looking at here. So what I'm arguing is that belief under normal circumstances is produced by a dynamic, philosophers like the word dialectical, it's the same idea, a dynamic and interactive way between interpretive stance and evidence. It's what I would call, so if we've looked at descriptive evidentialism, and we've looked at Fideism as another possibility, I would suggest the view that I'm articulating here is something that we might label interpretive evidentialism. Because what I'm arguing is that interpretation sets a stance that we take toward the world, but that stance then is responsive to the appearance of evidence within the world as we perceive it through our senses, as we hear it from testimony, and so forth, in all the ways that I've talked about already. So what I'm trying to get at is that the production of our beliefs involves both a subjective dimension, that dimension of our interpretive outlook, our hermeneutic stance, our interpretive stance, and the appearance of evidence within the world as we take that stance toward it. Now, I wish we had more time to talk about this. This may come out in part in Dr. Mudd's comments. But I want to admit, concede that the view I'm articulating is not original to me. This is a view that you can find versions, shards of in various thinkers. Three that I would identify in particular are Pascal, who talks, for example, about the heart having reasons that reason doesn't know about. I think he's getting to this idea of our stance toward the world within which evidence appears to us. Someone like Kierkegaard, who in his rather well-known major work, The Concluding on Scientific Postscript, talks about the different ways that you can look at the question of, he is talking about religious faith there, the different ways you can look at it. You can look at it subjectively in terms of asking yourself the question, how do I respond personally to the invitation to faith that is posed to me by the proclamation of the Christian gospel? Or you can look at it objectively in terms of what does it mean to talk about what Christianity is? Now, I don't have time to develop this, but I'll just mention, if you are familiar with Kierkegaard's book, you know that the pseudonymous author of The Concluding on Scientific Postscript, Johannes Climacus, makes a point of radically dichotomizing those two alternative points of view. The subjective point of view and the objective point of view, he says, are radically different. I suspect, personally, I couldn't make the case here today, and even if you ask me the questions later, I can't do it, but I'll suggest to you that I suspect Kierkegaard himself, as author, knows that we have to think about both of these dimensions as brought together. But in the book, the postscript itself, the pseudonymous author argues that we have to think of them as different. I think in part because he's responding to an objectivized version of Christianity that discounts the subjective response, primarily as a result of the philosopher Hegel. And we also find a version of this in William James, who contrasts what he calls our passional nature, that is what I would say our interpretive outlook on things, which is connected to emotion, as I'll mention in a moment here, to our logical nature, which has to do with the straightforward evaluation and assessment of evidence in our experience. So the bottom line then is belief is produced in us by relevant evidence, but that relevant evidence appears to us in a certain way because of our interpretive framework. All right, I'm going to go very briefly through some implications here, except for the last one, which I really want to get to. How do we acquire an interpretive stance? Well, I think the obvious answer is we all acquire an interpretive stance as part of the process of childhood formation. And again, we can see that it's produced in us by the evidence of our own perception, our interaction with the world, especially our interaction with and instruction by our parents and other authority figures, by testimony that we receive in appropriate ways through that process. And as a result of that, our interpretive stance is, to most of us, I would say, fairly transparent, fairly invisible. We don't even see it. Until you have the misfortune of coming to a university that the Jesuits have had something to do with, and they make you take philosophy courses, and before you know it, you're reflecting on your beliefs, you're reflecting on the world as you understand it and trying to make sense of it. And bringing that interpretive stance that you bear toward the world before your attention. So there's a sense in which I would say we absorb our interpretive framework as we grow up, and we simply hold it as a stance toward our experience, our acquisition of further information about the world. In normal belief change, all of us, of course, know that our beliefs change from time to time. But what often happens is we simply acquire new beliefs or slightly alter beliefs that are part of our overall outlook, what I would call our interpretive stance. So, for example, you might not know where Kathmandu is located until you're 18 years old and you take a geography class, right? You might not know that. But if you study a map and find it out, that's a case where you would simply add a belief to your existing interpretive framework. And notice that that belief is not central to your interpretive framework. We might say it lies on the periphery because it doesn't play as significant a role in shaping and interpreting other beliefs that you might have, as beliefs like, in general, human persons can understand and apprehend the world. That would be one that would be very important. That would be central to your beliefs if you held it. So we should contrast normal belief change with revolutionary belief change, which has to do with a crisis in and revision of your interpretive stance. And the classic example, really from the philosophy of religion, would be the growing understanding that people have, young people especially, have about the prevalence and really the extent of evil in our world. If, for a young person who's a theist, been brought up in a theistic interpretive outlook, right? The idea that terrible things happen frequently to a large number of people, it often provokes a severe crisis. We often call it a crisis of faith, right? But you can see in the language that I'm using, it's a crisis of interpretive frame. Now, of course, a crisis of interpretive frame doesn't mean that you will always reject the interpretive frame. Often what happens is that, depending on your level of reflection, depending on the resources, the cognitive, philosophical tools that are available to you, you might revise your interpretive frame. A classic example of that, especially related to the problem of evil, is the book of Job in the Bible, where Job has a significant experience of evil and suffering. And he comes to an understanding, though, that retains belief in God because of an encounter that he has with God. But in many cases, we know that if a crisis of interpretive stance is sufficiently crisis in nature, a result may be an alteration, a complete alteration of the interpretive stance. And there's a great example of this. Some of you will have read the story of the cave in Plato's Republic. Many people don't often read the following 2 or 3 pages, which are just amazing. You need to keep reading beyond the story about the cave. But Plato is there talking about what it means to know, and he actually suggests, he has a nice contrast he draws between a standard conception of knowledge, which has to do with pouring information. He uses a visual metaphor, pouring information into the eye, or filling the blind eye, he says. Another version of this that you might run into is often people think of knowledge as you come to Gonzaga, you go to your classes, you have a giant imaginary funnel, you put the funnel on top of your head. Knowledge is thrown all around in your classrooms. Some of it catches in the funnel and it goes into your head. That's one model. That's a kind of a cumulative model of knowledge. And Plato instead has a transformative model of knowledge that relates closely to this idea of a shift in the interpretive stance, where you come to see the world in a completely different way. And that's what we might call conversion. Now, there's a nice comparison, which I can't develop just for time reasons, of what I'm talking about to the philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn. Just briefly, what he notes is, in the history of science, we note there are periods that he calls normal science, where scientists are operating according to what he calls an existing paradigm. And that's roughly equivalent to what I'm calling the interpretive stance. In other words, they don't problematize the interpretive stance they're taking. They simply have an array of concepts that they're using and a set of problems they're trying to solve. But in revolutionary periods of science, Kuhn argues, what happens is that the methods and the canons of evidence and the problems themselves get called into question, and you have a radical alteration of what counts as science. And so you can see normal belief change is roughly equivalent to normal science, as Kuhn's describing it. What I'm calling revolutionary belief change, or even conversion, to use the religious term, is like what Kuhn is calling revolutionary belief change. Now, let's say a little bit more about, actually I'm going to skip evangelization just because we're short on time. Let's say a little bit more about conversion. What is conversion? If one experiences conflict in important ways with the interpretive stance one takes toward the world, the result is a crisis of belief, the breakdown of one's existing ways of understanding and navigating the world. This crisis precipitates a further process in which either, as we said, the conflicting experiences must be reinterpreted and thereby accommodated within the existing interpretive stance, or the interpretive framework itself will be discarded. Now, how do we think about this? I've used this metaphor from Plato about turning the soul. Another idea is we might say conversion is something like entering into a new world. Because the shift in interpretive frame recasts relationships and meanings of objects in the world and reorders the system of values that exist for a person. For example, describing Christian conversion, St. Paul famously says that in Christ all things become new. But the reason that the converted person is a new creature for whom the creation itself is new, such a person sees the world in a completely fresh way. Now, again, I'm going to truncate some things here, compress a few things. What's the role of evidence in revolutionary belief formation? We might think that it's simply a matter of you see the world one way, and then maybe that particular way of seeing the world becomes untenable or becomes problematic, and you just radically shift to a different way of viewing the world. That really is the Fideistic account of how conversion takes place, right? That it's a radical act of will, you discard an interpretive stance, and you simply take on a new one. I want to say, however, that actually what occurs is that we seek an interpretive model, an interpretive frame that makes sense of the world as we experience it, even as we understand that we can't fully and completely understand that interpretive frame until we, in a sense, inhabit or abide within it. You guys know what I mean? That's an interpretive way of talking, or illustrative way of talking. We often hear people say things like, you can't understand what it's like to be a blank until you live it, right? Whatever that is. And certainly religious people will often say that. You can't understand what it's like to be a Christian until you inhabit, until you commit to the Christian outlook, the Christian interpretive frame. And I would say that is true, but it's also the case that we can understand what it means to find a competing interpretive stance plausible or even appealing, insofar as it makes sense of our experience in a way that compares favorably to the way that we currently view the world as. What I was going to say about evangelism is actually the process in which people invite others, and I mean evangelism here actually in the neutral, non-religious sense. Evangelism just means good news. So when you believe something, right, when you see the world a certain way, you're going to say, this is the way the world really is, and you're going to be evangelical about that to the extent that you care about it. But I think it would certainly be true of Christian evangelism as well, or religious evangelism more generally. What evangelists do is they don't simply invite people to take a blind leap in the dark, as a fideistic account would suggest. Instead, what they do is they ask, here's a way, or they propose, here's a way of seeing the world. How does this comport with your experience of the world? And of course, to the extent that a new interpretive framework explains and accounts for our encounter with the world and what we know, we're going to find it winsome, plausible, even worthy of acceptance. Now, I want to go back to that quote that I gave you earlier. I don't think I put it here again, but okay, no, that's in a moment here, so hang on. The quote from Mark's Gospel, "I believe, help me in my unbelief." Remember, that's the father of the epileptic boy. Jesus asked, do you believe that I can heal him? And I would say, if we try to put a gloss on what he's saying, I can faintly see the world from the stance that you're proposing. And indeed, the father of the epileptic boy brought his son to Jesus in the first place because he had heard testimony of miraculous healings by Jesus. And so he has evidence on which he's basing this interpretive move that he's making. But he's right at that point that we often are, right? Where we understand the appeal, the plausibility, even the ultimate reasonability of an interpretive outlook, and yet we're not there yet. We're not wholly inhabiting it. We're not wholly in place in it. So the idea there is not merely that we conjure the belief out of nothing. It's simply we understand how it makes sense, how it's plausible. Okay. So what can we say about this? What are some implications of this analysis of belief I've tried to offer? Well, notice what I've tried to do. I've tried at every step to say that belief involves evidence, certainly, but it also involves our interpretive stance. It's a both and. It's a dynamic. It's a dialectic, as I suggested. What does this suggest? Well, I think there are two particular problems that this analysis of belief helps us shed light on. One is relativism. Relativism is the view that whatever beliefs we happen to hold are true. Now, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people find this view persuasive. It's something that if some of you guys are freshmen, you're here from my critical thinking class, you'll hear talk about that in your college years. But why is this belief that that beliefs are the product of our own will or choice? Why is it plausible? I think I have at least a partial answer. That's because will or choice does play a role in the formation of beliefs. The problem with relativism, however, or at least one problem, there may turn out to be multiple problems on various levels, epistemic, moral, and so forth, but a key problem that we can see based on this analysis is that relativism rightly acknowledges the role that will or choice plays in belief, but simply ignores the evidential aspect. We don't simply conjure beliefs up out of nothing. And that's on the descriptive level, and notice that it also has implications, as we said, for the normative level. So, while relativism is a plausible view for a variety of reasons, I mean, we might think because of this idea that we construct our beliefs as we engage the world. There's a kind of truth to that. There's a role that the will or choice plays. But it has to also acknowledge the dynamic of evidence as well. Or the implication is our beliefs can simply be arbitrary, and that doesn't make any sense as we've already noticed. The bigger problem, though, is the one that I started with, Fideism. What can we say based on this analysis about Fideism? Well, what I want to argue is Fideism also rightly affirms the role of will or choice in belief. But again, it makes a kind of oversimplification mistake in denying the role of any and all forms of evidence. Now, we can see this on the descriptive level, and then I think we can see it as well on the normative level. Descriptively, I think we can see that we simply never produce beliefs as a bare act of an arbitrary choice by the will. We don't simply conjure up beliefs in God, in the reality of the external world, in the moral character of other human beings, anything, right? Beliefs on any of those subjects are always going to be the result of an interplay between the interpretive stance we take toward the world and the evidence that comes back to us shaped by that interpretive stance. And so we don't simply assert beliefs, and therefore we don't simply construct beliefs out of whole cloth. And indeed, I would say, even though sometimes some, at least allegedly, some religious believers are themselves inclined to affirm a fideistic conception of faith, I think if pressed on this, we can see why that would be implausible. If belief truly is fideistic, then that means it's wholly arbitrary, because you could just as well willingly choose any belief as well as any other. Not only a belief in, say, the triune God of Christianity, but a belief in I'll pick Dawkins' favorite example, the flying spaghetti monster, right? Either belief would be just as plausible if they're simply produced out of whole cloth, ex nihilo, by a bare act of the will. Instead, if we think that beliefs on religious matters, like beliefs on scientific matters and everything else, are produced by this interplay of interpretive stance and evidence that we encounter in the world, we can see that our beliefs about religious matters are going to be responsive to evidence as well, and hence fideism doesn't make any sense. Thank you. Okay, I have to change hats again. I'm the introducer. And I'd like to introduce my colleague from the Religious Studies Department, Dr. Joe Mudd, who will have some comments, and then we'll see what we can do to discuss and solve these problems.
So to echo Dr. Calhoun, thank you to all of you for being here. It's always fun to have these conversations in a full room. So Dr. Calhoun asked us to consider how beliefs are formed in order to move beyond the claims of evidentialists on the one hand and fideists on the other. He argues that beliefs are formed in relation to evidentiary questions about our experience of the world. Religious beliefs, like other beliefs, therefore, are not simply a matter of a willing, blind leap, but of affirming, as he says, the power of a new interpretive frame to explain and account for one's experience. So Dr. Calhoun holds for what he calls an interpretive evidentialism, which asserts that beliefs are produced by relevant evidence within the context of a particular interpretive framework. By way of response, I would like to echo certain of Dr. Calhoun's points and to then clarify the roles of evidence and will in the formation of beliefs. By way of doing so, I will have recourse to an elaboration of conversion from the Jesuit philosopher and theologian Bernard Lonergan. Anybody who knows me knows that ultimately it all comes down to Lonergan. So those of you who've had me in class, this is going to be some Lonergan redux. So beliefs are manifold. As Dr. Calhoun has indicated, they can easily also be mistaken. Most of what we say we know, we in fact believe. We have not carried out the necessary evidentiary experiments to verify for ourselves all those explanations of our world we take to be true. We rely on the testimony of specialists and the consensus of communities of specialists. And often these beliefs enable significant human progress, so they're not simply willy-nilly arbitrary decisions in the dark. For example, we believe that the intelligible relations among chemical elements captured in the periodic table are correct. We do not simply spend in chemistry class all of our time retracing Mendeleev's steps to get there. We take it as given. We take it on belief. Instead, we do chemistry. We move to the next step using those tools as they're set. We human beings are then, by historical necessity, if not by nature, believers. It's what we spend a lot of our time doing, actually, trusting other people. We cannot, each of us on our own, reproduce the entire body of human knowledge accumulated through history. Rather, we depend on the accumulated insights of our culture to form our way of looking at the world. This accumulated knowledge forms our world. We can also discover, however, that the accumulated knowledge of our particular culture is in some way fundamentally flawed, and we can begin to reconstruct a worldview by verifying or falsifying inherited beliefs. Indeed, the role of the philosopher for which the club gets its name, right? Socrates is consistently inquiring into the doxa, the opinions of his own time, which are mediated to his audience by the culture in which they live. And so the question is whether they are adequate to the intelligible relations among things we can know by asking and answering questions about them. So we have two ways of looking at the world: the sort of settled opinion that we sort of learn in the process of formation that Dr. Calhoun referred to, and that we kind of repeat, right? We get these kinds of slogans or half-truths about reality that we repeat. And insofar as we continue to repeat them, they start to shape this interpretive stance toward the world. But we can also engage in the activity of inquiring into those sort of half-truths that we sort of have in our pockets and wield at a moment's notice. So, as Dr. Calhoun has indicated, our beliefs come together to form the interpretive stance we absorb as we are formed by our cultures. We have an interpretive stance before we know we have one. It's already there. Thanks, Mom and Dad. So they constitute what I will call, using a phrase from Lonergan, a horizon of meaning. One's horizon is one's reality. Just as Dr. Calhoun said of his notion of interpretive stance, one's horizon initially consists of the received tradition of a culture, and so a whole series of implicit beliefs, frequently captured in slogans or pithy descriptions of reality. They're normally very stable. With time, our horizon broadens out to include new experiences, often by incorporating them within already existing categories. So we might think about our interpretive stance broadening out. And that incorporation of new sets of data into pre-existing categories can take a kind of a violent form that postmodern theorists try to alert our attention to, of the reduction of new data to the same, and the refusal then to have any shift in our way of seeing the world. But in those cases where human desire to know is empowered fully rather than stifled, our beliefs can undergo radical changes or conversions. When we confront experiences radically contrary to our received tradition, we can experience a conversion that is not another broadening of an existing horizon to include additional data, but a new beginning, or what Lonergan will call an about-face, a reversal. And Lonergan identifies three ways in which our horizons undergo this kind of radical reversal, in which we experience ourselves as new subjects in new worlds. First, and perhaps most controversial among Lonergan's claims, we can experience an intellectual conversion, which he describes as a radical clarification and consequently the elimination of an exceedingly stubborn and misleading myth concerning reality, objectivity, and human knowing. The myth is that knowing is like looking, that objectivity is seeing what is there to be seen and not seeing what is not there, and that the real is the already out there now to be looked at. This is Lonergan's way of describing what Dr. Calhoun described as an evidentialist approach, right? That whatever reality is, it is to be known by looking at the relevant set of data. And the key metaphor here in knowing is the ocular metaphor of looking. Skipping ahead. So that is to say that what is to be accounted among the real are only those things for which we have evidence, analogous, if not restricted to, the evidence of the visual kind. Within that way of thinking, religious belief is ruled out of court, since it purports to speak about that reality which is, by its very being, invisible. So this is why we get into these sort of critiques of religion of the new atheist variety, which are simply operating at cross purposes, right? If you say, where's the evidence for the existence of God? Properly speaking, from the theological horizon, there isn't evidence of the being in question, right? There may be evidence of something else secondary to that being, but right, you can't go look at God. Right? If we just have the right telescope, right? Get a stronger magnifier on Hubble, and we can get to where God is over and figure out God's address and then point the telescope that way. So knowing is not a matter of looking for Lonergan. As our account of belief reveals, knowing is a compound of experiencing, understanding, and judging. The evidentialist, however, restricts knowing to experiencing without realizing that most of what they know by assenting to the judgments of others.
This may be a newsflash, but scientists also have interpretive frameworks, right? They leave the lab and they go do their regular business, and they have a whole series of value commitments that animates their being in the world. Right? It's not strictly operating in an empiricist mode. Experience only raises questions. This is the problem of epistemology. Experience only raises questions. It does not answer them. An empiricist, reductive empiricist approach is going to say that all questions are answered by experience. But really just experience raises questions. Data are just givens. They're just there. So the work of interpreting them is already to move beyond the level of empirical analysis. Let's begin. So Lonergan's critical realism attends to the fact that human knowing pronounces the world mediated by meaning to be the real world. The real world that we know is the one that we come to know by interpreting sets of data and judging whether our interpretations of them have been correct, and then mediating those interpretations and judgments to other people. That's the world that we actually live in. So we know it only by cooperating with the immanent self-transcending dynamism of our desire to know. We experience ourselves as this immanent source of self-transcendence anytime we move from not knowing to knowing, from having a question to having an answer. It's an experience of self-transcendence. What I did not know, I now know, or can affirm to be true. And our ability to undertake this process of self-transcendence and questioning and answering is in principle infinite. We can wonder about everything. We don't have the answers for everything, but we can wonder about everything. Right? And so that gives Lonergan a clue into the kind of thing that we are and the kind of work that we do intellectually. To begin to cooperate with our immanent source of self-transcendence requires that we overcome any belief that constitutes the horizon of what Lonergan calls naive realism, that idea that knowing is a process of taking a look. Okay? So if that's our view of reality, then we're sort of overlooking these aspects of understanding and judging that are part of what we're actually doing. Right? So to say that in order to know reality, you look simply at the empirical level is actually to make a judgment. Right? It's not something that emerges.